Hey, how's it going? My name is Wes. Welcome back to another lesson. In today's lesson, instead of looking at another verb as we usually do in these yellow verb lessons, we will actually look at something different. We will look at the 3 different types of verbs that exist in the Spanish language. So in today's lesson, I hope to explain to you what the 3 different types of verbs are in the Spanish language and how you can use that knowledge to understand how to conjugate these different types of verbs. So without further ado, let's get into today's lesson. Alright, so before we dive deep into today's lesson, let's first look at the 6 different verbs that we have already learned so far. And those are to want, to have, to be as a characteristic, to be as a state, to can or be able to, and to go. So,
querer,
to want,
tener,
to have,
ser,
to be as a characteristic,
estar,
to be as a state,
poder,
which means to can or be able to,
ir,
which was the last verb we learned, which was to go in Spanish. And just as a little refresher, but also as good practice for you, let's have a look at all of the I or yo form conjugations of these verbs. And let's start with querer. So, if you want to say I want, then we said yo quiero.
yo quiero,
Then if you want to say I have, was yo tengo.
yo tengo,
Then if you want to say I am, and we are talking about a characteristic, so we use the verb ser, then we learned that the correct conjugation is yo soy.
yo soy,
I am. So for example, yo soy de Holanda. I am from Holland or from the Netherlands. Yo soy. I am. And then of course we have a different way of saying I am when we talk about a state. So I am tired or I am at the park, for example. And this was yo estoy.
yo estoy,
Then I can or I am able to. This was yo puedo.
yo puedo,
I can or I am able to. And then the last verb that we learned was I go. So to go, which was the verb ir in Spanish. And we saw that this was a very irregular verb. So it changed a lot as soon as we started to conjugate this verb. And this of course was yo voy. Yo voy. I go.
yo voy,
Right, so now that we have a little refresher of these 6 different verbs that we have learned so far, let's have a little bit of a closer look at them. And what I want to explain to you in today's lesson is that in Spanish there's 3 different types of verbs, or basically we can separate all of the verbs in Spanish into 3 different categories. And those categories are verbs that end with er, so querer, tener, verbs that end in ir, and verbs that end in ar. And so let's first have a look at the first category of verbs, which are verbs that end in er. And we already learned a few of these. So for example,
querer,
ends with er, which means to want.
tener,
To have also ends with er,
ser,
which we also learned, which was to be, if we're talking about a characteristic. As you see, it also ends with er. And then
poder,
to be able to or to can also ends with er. So this is the first category of verbs that we have out of the 3. So verbs that end in er. So now let's zoom in a little bit more into these verbs that end with er to see if we can perhaps spot a pattern between all of these verbs. So let's look at the verb
querer,
as an example, which was to want in Spanish. So we saw the different types of conjugations. And what we also saw was that the beginning or the stem of this verb was mostly the same across all of the different conjugations. And so the stem of the verb, so the black part that you see here, roughly stays the same among all the different types of conjugations. However, the thing that changes depending on who it is that we are talking about is the yellow part. So if we're talking about I, so yo, then we add an o after the stem. If we were talking about you, tú, then we add es. And if we were talking about we, so nosotros, nosotras, we add hemos. And actually what we can do is to look at those endings separately, because we can actually use them, and this is the trick, we can use them as a basis for all the other verbs that also end in er. So here as an example, I put 3 different verbs that all end in er next to each other, and as you can see, you can spot a pattern here, which is that they all use the same endings. So every time we talking about you, so tú, we add es after the stem of the verb. And when we're talking about we, so nosotros, nosotras, we add emos, so hemos, after the stem. And this trick actually blew my mind when I first heard of it, because now anytime we see a verb in Spanish that ends with ER, and there are hundreds, maybe thousands of verbs that end in ER in Spanish, we can easily guess how to conjugate in the correct forms. This is actually super useful for learning new verbs. And then, of course, this does not only apply to ER verbs, but as I said before, we have 3 different types of categories of verbs. So let's look at the second one. And those are verbs that end in AR. So for example, to accept,
aceptar,
to walk.
caminar,
You might already know this one, to dance,
bailar,
or
ayudar,
which means to help in Spanish. So those are all verbs that end in AR. Now again here, we see the same thing happen. So for example, let's dive into the verb
bailar,
which is to dance. So again, the stem of the verb here stays the same. So bail is the stem, so the black part that you see on the screen. But the ending changes depending on who it is that we are talking about. So yo bailo with an O. Tú bailas with an AS ending. Él, ella, usted baila. Now only add an A instead of AS. And then of course we can also take a look at this, the endings individually, and apply those to any other verb that also ends in AR. So as an example, again, I have 3 different types of verbs that all end in AR. And by simply using this trick, we now know how to correctly conjugate all of these different verbs. So now again, we unlocked hundreds of new verbs that we can easily guess how to conjugate. Now, of course, what's important to mention is that this rule or this trick does not apply to every individual verb in Spanish, and that is obviously because some verbs are just a bit different and they behave differently. But overall, this is a great technique that you can use to, from now on, not have to learn every single verb individually, but to already guess how to conjugate a certain verb. And then probably because you conjugate it in a certain way, you will notice that something might be wrong, and then you can make a slight adjustment to make it correct if it's an irregular verb. But this is definitely by far my favorite trick that you can learn when you're studying verbs in Spanish. Now, of course, we also need to talk about our last ending, which is the IR ending. So verbs that end in IR. So for example,
vivir,
which means to live,
investir,
which is to invest,
decidir,
which is to decide, or
añadir,
which means to add. So let's look at vivir, for example, which is the Spanish verb for to live in English. And then as we can see, the stem always consistently stays the same. And then we can take those endings and look at them separately and use them to correctly conjugate other verbs that also end in IR in Spanish. So for example, investir, decidir, and añadir. Alright, so that's pretty much what I wanted to show you in today's lesson. I think this is a very helpful lesson for anybody that is very serious about learning verbs or that has trouble with learning verbs. So as a wrap-up of today's lesson, the 3 different types of verbs in Spanish are verbs that end with either ER, AR, and IR. And simply by learning a couple of verbs in every category and learning the different conjugations of that verb, you can use this trick in which you just grab the endings of all of the different verbs and then add those to other verbs in the same category to form the right conjugation, even if you don't really know the verb yet. So with this trick, we now literally have access to thousands of different verbs in Spanish, which is pretty cool, and it blew my mind when I first heard about this trick. So I hope that it also did the same for you. Alright, so that's it for today's lesson. Again, I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that you got something out of this. And as always, I hope to see you in the next lesson. If you have any questions or you want to dive deeper in today's lesson, you can do so by going to my website, which is SpanishWithWes.com. As for now, that's it for today's lesson. And of course, I hope to see you in the next one. Adios.